Debate intensifies over the progressive income tax, and Chicago Mayor-Elect Lori Lightfoot visits the State House. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. With me here today, Peter Hancock is here from State House. He is a State House reporter for Capital News Illinois, which is a relatively new organization, and we are happy to have you here and happy to have you and the other folks from Capital News Illinois there, adding some more stories to papers like the State Journal-Register. So thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.
And Brian Mackey is back. He is State House reporter for NPR Illinois. Welcome back, Brian.
Good to be with you as always, Bernie.
So, some weeks ago, the governor had a press conference in his office at the State House talking about how wonderful a progressive income tax would be for Illinois. They kind of redid that this past week with a lot of legislators behind him. His Deputy Governor Dan Hines, former comptroller of Illinois, who's kind of overseeing the graduated income tax push. And this time, one of the legislators there was Don Harmon, who is a Democratic state senator from Oak Park. He is the sponsor of now the language of the proposed constitutional amendment that the governor and these legislators hope that the House and the Senate will each pass by overwhelming majorities, extraordinary majorities this spring, so that voters can vote on this constitutional amendment in the November of 2020 election. Peter, how's things looking?
Well, it's probably looking good in the Senate right now. I've talked to some House leaders who say they're pretty confident it will go through, but you don't quite have enough people who've signed on and say, I'm definitely going to vote for it. And that's kind of normal for a big major policy change. You wait until you see everything before you jump on board. It is getting a lot of opposition from business groups. The Illinois Chamber has come out against it. And it's kind of interesting. It's the same proposal that's been out there for a few years now, but suddenly they're raising a new argument that says it would remove a provision in the current Constitution that prohibits essentially double taxes or triple taxes.
Or more than one flat tax rate.
Yeah, more than one tax rate.
Or more than one tax on any given dollar.
Yeah,
the way the
you can only tax this dollar of income once. Right. And so it's led to this kind of interesting academic discussion about what was meant during the Constitutional Convention back in the 70s, as I understand.
Yeah, 1970 is when the Constitution was ratified. I think it was in 69 they were meeting. And
yeah.
Mike Madigan was in the Constitutional Convention. He was a delegate. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so Senator Harmon is saying that was put in there to prevent the legislature from getting around the single flat tax rate by saying, well, we'll have a flat tax on income up to $30,000 a year, and then a second flat tax on income between 30 and 60, and so on like that. But the business groups in the chamber are now arguing that without that language, you could have this graduated income tax and then start applying surcharges on top of that for certain categories of income. And I think what they're saying is that there's a lot of distrust about Springfield and about the General Assembly in general, that when you start allowing them to treat different economic classes of people differently, that it can lead to all kinds of mischief. So the idea is that they're going to have a bill that says, if the constitutional amendment passes, this is what will go into law. But they're also saying the legislature can come back and change that at any time. So some people are kind of nervous about that.
Right. Brian, any thoughts on where the brackets go? One of the other arguments, I guess, I heard Bill Brady is the Republican leader of the Senate from Bloomington, and he was saying the flat tax is a business advantage to Illinois, and outside businesses are looking at our state and seeing that we might raise taxes on high income earners, and that's already being used against our state when business is coming here. But any thoughts on if the overwhelmingly Democratic legislature will do what the governor wants here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the arguments we're hearing against a graduated income tax are the same arguments we've heard against any sort of change upward in tax policy for Illinois, right? That businesses will flee, the rich people will flee. There hasn't been a lot of evidence of that. I mean, we certainly have seen businesses leave downstate communities, but a lot of them end up moving into Chicago. We saw that with Caterpillar. We've seen that with ADM. I mean, Chicago is still a world-class city. It's got an international airport where you can get just about anywhere else in the world from there. I think it is still very attractive to a lot of big businesses. We saw Boeing relocate here a decade ago. Maybe not the best example of a company that you want around
ups and downs
these days.
lately.
Yes. But you know, Chicago was and remains a world-class city. Downstate Illinois, much like a lot of rural areas, has continued to struggle, particularly downstate cities. And there's just not a lot of evidence that I've seen, convincing evidence that, you know, tax policy really influences businesses that much. And I think Chicago was still one of the top choices in Site Selection magazine, which is one of these niche trade publications, where businesses choose where to locate. I think what you often hear from businesses is that they also want stability. And that's certainly something that we have seen lacking in Illinois government finances, and that's one of the things that Governor Pritzker says he's trying to solve with a graduated income tax, is more predictability and stability of money coming into state government.
Right, and of course Republicans would say, well, they just want more money, why don't you talk cuts? And of course when you start talking cuts, the governor says it's draconian and it will hurt these programs terribly, and the Republicans say, well, we need more businesses, and we, you know, that will generate more money there. There's also the argument that Dale Ryder, who is a state senator from Mattoon, I know, argued that, well, if you're going to have a graduated tax, it's going to be so much easier to pass a tax on just the rich. Those people over there pay, but not most of you. And he says that would also, of course, be a disincentive. Republicans are saying, again, job creators are the people with a lot of money who would be taxed more. And Democrats are saying, I think Senator Harman responded, it's always hard to raise taxes no matter what. So these are just the arguments we're hearing.
And I think one of the things I've always heard from economic development experts and from people who study why businesses move from one place to another or why they decide to locate somewhere, state taxes are almost always near the bottom of the list in terms of priorities. What they need is a skilled labor force. They need access to raw materials if they're involved in manufacturing. They need access to transportation networks, markets to sell their goods, access to capital. These are the things that are important in deciding where to locate. How much they pay in the state taxes, well, first of all, the bigger the business is, the more control they have over how much tax they want to pay.
The better lawyers they have. That kind of thing.
So, I mean, you know, the idea that people are going to flee the state solely because of taxes, well, you know, why is California as big as it is? You know, there are other things involved than just state taxes.
Well, we'll see. There's also, Brian, the Better Government Association did a story that I know our paper ran it. They are a group that does advocate for some things, but they also have a reporting side that plays it reasonably straight. But they talked about what happened when Illinois raised the flat tax from 3% to 5% between, I think it was 2011 and 2014. And what they said was it kind of negated the idea that the rich people will flee because more people were making more money, and there were fewer people based on certain I think they were using census data or revenue data. You know, people in lower categories decreased as if we weren't forcing the rich people out of the state. Your thoughts on what you saw?
Yeah, I mean, this comports with other studies I've seen. The Guardian had one a few years ago where they looked at mobility among various income levels and found that millionaires tend to not move as much as people in the middle class and at the lower level of the income strata. And this is, you know, this goes against what we often hear in political arguments and editorial pages around the state, particularly the Chicago Tribune, who, you know, hear anecdotally, they hear of people leaving the state and people complain about taxes. Therefore, they put that together and say people are leaving the state because of the tax policy. But when you actually look at who is leaving the state, it is people at the lower level of the income brackets, and also, as the Illinois Board of Higher Education recently put out a report, that it's 18 and 19-year-olds who are leaving the state, because a lot more people are going to college elsewhere. And that's something that, you know, we've certainly also heard anecdotally for a long time, that people who have kids at that you know, age where they're starting to explore different colleges find that, you know, they can get as good, if not a better deal, by going to an out-of-state school in some cases, because state support for higher education has dropped so much in Illinois, at least for operating money. It has gone up for pension funding. But you know, this is something where who is really leaving Illinois? Is it the rich people, or is it lower income, middle income, and college students? And it seems to be more on that other side.
I was going to say that this is going on nationally. It's not just Illinois. Several years ago, the Atlantic magazine had this great graphic. It's called a heat map, and it showed a map of the United States with every county color-coded. And the darker the county was, the more higher percentage of adult population with college degrees. And from, let's say, 1970 to 1990, what you saw was this bleaching out of middle America as people with college degrees gravitated toward the east and west coasts. This has been going on. I just moved here from Kansas. I can tell you they're talking about the exact same thing there that they're talking about in Illinois. This is a national phenomenon of young people leaving middle America and going to the coasts.
I have my own interesting anecdote, which is, I don't know if the anecdotal information is good or not, but I spoke just in this last week to a student advisory committee, high school students who are working with a new state representative, Jeff Kiker, from Sycamore, Illinois, northern Illinois, near DeKalb, Northern Illinois University. And in this very involved kids, there were about a dozen of them. 4 of them told me, I think it was 4, were going out, maybe it was 3, were going out of state. One of them was going to Las Vegas to college there because the cost was going to be about half as much as going to the University of Illinois for a similar program. And somebody was going to Wisconsin because Wisconsin has a good deal to get Illinois students for very close to what Wisconsin residents pay, and it's less than they would pay in Illinois also. So it is a problem that colleges and universities in Illinois in recent years with our budget problems have had to up tuition, and there have been legislative activities trying to get more scholarship money to kids and more flexibility for the colleges and universities to use the scholarship money. The governor just signed a bill to do that just in the last few days. But it's clearly a problem that kids are leaving.
And I can tell you, we've gotten into basically a 2-tiered system of public college education in the United States. There are states that have been funding it and states that haven't. And in the states that haven't, I can tell you, they're not only losing students, they're losing faculty, they're losing researchers. There are headhunters out there looking for top-notch faculty that hasn't had a pay raise in 5 years.
Well, it's interesting, Governor Rauner talked about helping universities, but didn't like top-heavy administration, and universities got the brunt of the 2-year budget impasse. Governor Pritzker has been talking a lot about fixing that, and we'll see where it goes, because it takes money to do these things.
Yeah, and he has proposed, I think, half or less than half of what the universities had asked for in terms of their funding. Now, the idea is Pritzker is saying his current budget and the next year's budget will be bridges to getting to when he can actually start seeing more money roll in from the graduated income tax. But of course, that's if the legislature passes it and if the voters approve it and if it pulls in as much money as his economic forecasters say it will.
Right. Another education/money issue is that both the House and the Senate have passed versions in the last few days of bills that would raise, I think it's over 5 years, the starting teacher salary in Illinois to $40,000. On the books, it's a really old law, so it's like $10,000 or $11,000 right now. I don't think districts are paying that, but they are often in probably the 20s and certainly the 30s, and this would raise it, I think, to $32,000 shortly, and then up to $40,000 by the 2023-24 school year. Katie Stewart of Edwardsville is the sponsor of the House bill that passed. Andy Minar of Bunker Hill in Macoupin County is the Senate sponsor of a bill, so I'm sure they'll get together and pass something. The legislature a couple of years ago passed this. When maybe it was last year when Governor Rauner was here and vetoed it because, as some Republicans argued this time, it's an unfunded mandate to school districts, particularly small school districts. But as we were looking up just before the show, Peter, the Illinois Education Association is for this because there's a teacher shortage and people to go into teaching and to want to stay in Illinois and teach, they want more pay. On the other hand, this will cost money too.
It will, and I used to cover school districts, covered them for quite a while, and I think one of the interesting parts of this, clearly Illinois has a teacher shortage, especially central Illinois and parts of southern Illinois have a very difficult time, and salaries are certainly an issue. In a lot of other districts, though, you will often see competition whenever new money becomes available for pay raises. and this usually is the subject of collective bargaining between the teachers union and the school board. Do you put the money in the front end of the scale, new teachers coming in, which clearly many districts here need? There are other districts where they're having a hard time keeping hold of their veteran teachers because they haven't had a pay raise in a long time. And so the veteran teachers, who often have a little bit of swing within the local teachers union, will say, hey, how about some money for me too? I've been here for a long time, and there's a district down the road that's willing to pay me more. So I think if this goes through the next round of collective bargaining, district by district, you're going to see some maybe some interesting conversations about that.
Yeah, it's a difficult situation, and I don't know if we're even talking anymore, as Governor Rauner was, about trying to move some of the pension costs onto the local districts, because now the teachers' retirement system pays for pensions of like every system outside of Illinois, and that's one of the big problems that every unit of government in Illinois seems to have, is very lucrative pension systems. I'm sure that there are some people who would argue with that, and some people aren't, getting rich on their pension, but they're defined benefit plans, and there are many who argue that everything new should be 401ks, and that's just not happening in government yet. So
no, and I don't see a lot of movement toward that with Governor Pritzker,
yeah.
although Speaker Madigan has in the past. I mean, he was one of the first people to start supporting this cost shift idea.
That's true. We will see where that goes. It all takes that. Speaking of governments that need money and whatever, the Lori Lightfoot shocked the world by getting 75% of the vote in a Chicago mayor's election, beating Tony Preckwinkle, who was an alderman and then is still president of the Cook County Board. And Mayor Lightfoot came to Springfield this week, spoke to the House, spoke to the Senate, met with reporters a couple of times, met with other people. I know she even mentioned today that she had had a conversation with Jim Langfelder, the mayor of Springfield, which turned out it was at a legislative reception one morning. Just impressions of how she came off in Springfield, and if it is a positive thing for the mayor of Chicago to come down here when there's a fair amount of talk from time to time about differences between areas of the state.
You're soft pedaling the differences, right? There have been literally been separatist rallies,
yes, and
proposing
we might talk
another
about that
state.
in a minute,
We'll come back to that. So let's say I think it's a pretty rare thing for a mayor of Chicago to visit Springfield, which is strange when you think of how much, as Lightfoot herself said, and she gave a little civics lesson in her news conferences, that so much of what cities do kind of flows through Springfield, especially in terms of money, right? Cities in Illinois are creatures of the state government, and a lot of their power in terms of raising money, which is where Chicago's biggest needs are, is money, flows through Springfield. So she's making it a priority.
Even if it's not coming from the rest of the state, Springfield legislators have to authorize what the city can do.
Right, and we should be clear about that. Chicago is, one of the areas of the state, there's this talking point you hear downstate about we're sending our tax dollars to Chicago. I thought it was interesting that State Representative Sue Scherer, who represents Springfield and Decatur, was one of the people who lined up to pose for a picture with Mayor Lightfoot. I still have the mailer from one of her first campaigns where it said a beautiful picture of the Chicago River, and it said, Chicago, a nice place to visit, not a nice place to send our tax dollars.
And that was probably paid for by the Democratic Party run by Mike
Madigan
of Chicago.
Of Chicago.
They know how to sell it downstate.
Exactly. But I mean, I will say, that is a myth, right? The Paul Simon Public Policy Institute crunched the numbers a year or so ago and found that, downstate really gets a lot more out of state government than it sends in. The suburbs get a lot less. The city is kind of about even in terms of, state money. But, what she was talking about is just, if the state passes the graduated income tax, the income tax is shared between the state and the local governments in Illinois. And, that's one of her priorities. So she is putting in FaceTime here. You asked if it's a good idea. I can remember one time when I saw Mayor Roma Emanuel in Springfield. Now, I didn't entirely overlap with his term. There was a year, so he might have come down before I started again in the Capitol in 2012. But I can remember once. I think Mayor Daley used to be an occasional presence, and there used to be a big gathering, a Taste of Chicago in Springfield.
Oh, that's right.
Which would be sort of outside
a tent outside near the Lincoln
which was
statue.
A way
they close off some streets, and they would show off some Chicago restaurants.
And it was a way of building a bridge to downstate,
right?
And kind of do some lobbying there. So I think it can't hurt. Chicago is very important to the state of Illinois in terms of being an economic power, as we were talking about earlier. So if those relations can improve and you can sort of but there will still be divides on issues like guns and other things.
Sure.
My takeaway from it was her call for unity and a very clear attempt to put aside this age-old rivalry between Chicago and downstate, or Chicago versus not Chicago. She said Chicago is an integral part of Illinois. It needs the state as much as the state needs Chicago. And the line that caught me was when she said, I-80 is a strip of pavement, it's not a border. Because it struck me that there actually is a resolution that's not going anywhere, authored by a handful of downstate Republicans, urging Congress to declare Chicago a separate state.
Right, and and I will discuss that in a second, yes.
Yeah, so I thought it was a very bold call for unity, acknowledgement of the people downstate and how much they contribute to Illinois, as well as how much Chicago contributes to Illinois. And she says, we rise or fall together.
Right.
So I thought it was a good message for her to be giving and setting a different kind of tone than has existed.
Right.
In the past.
I'll also say that she's a first-time candidate. I mean, she was a federal prosecutor and then she worked for a big law firm in Chicago, but she's never held elective office before. So her dealing with all these legislators, it's very different from some other mayors of Chicago, Mayor Harold Washington and Mayor Daley, both of them, the father and the son. They were all legislators before they were mayor of Chicago. So they knew Springfield, they knew people in Springfield. She doesn't really have those connections, and she defeated the person in her election who knew everybody. So it's a kind of the outsider one again with 75% of the vote.
I know a lot of observers, national and statewide, made a lot of the fact that she is an African-American woman and she is openly gay, and this was an indicator that Chicago is coming out, into the modern age. What somebody else noted was that she's also a former federal prosecutor.
Yeah.
And Chicago City Hall has experience with federal prosecutors, most of which is not really good. And the idea that 75% of the voters in Chicago wanted to put a former prosecutor in City Hall is maybe an indication that the people of Chicago are a little tired of the way things have been, and they want to see it run differently.
Yes, and Toni Preckwinkle also, had she won, she would also be the first African-American woman being mayor of the city of Chicago. And she did get in some trouble because she was very close to people like Ed Burke, who is a member of the city council there, who just won re-election despite the fact that he's under indictment for allegedly seeking bribes from someone who wanted a zoning change for their fast food
running
restaurants.
A shakedown operation.
Yeah, that's the allegation. But
the allegation.
So yeah, even though Preckwinkle came on as a reformer years ago, she became associated with some of the bad stuff up there. Let's talk about that separatist movement. I think the main sponsor is Brad Halbrook, a Republican of Shelbyville, and he has said things like traditional family values of downstate are under attack because those people like abortion and don't like guns, but also that they take our money, but there is evidence that, as Brian said, that isn't necessarily the case. Although I know Representative Halbrook has gone on to say things like, well, the kids that are in the universities downstate are really from up there, so our dollars are paying for champagne to educate kids from DuPage and Cook County. So it's an odd and interesting way to look at it. I did find it interesting that C.D. Davidsmeyer is a Republican state representative from Jacksonville, place with a couple of nice little colleges. He signed on to this resolution as well. I think there are now 5 downstate
4
Republicans.
or 5, yeah.
And he basically said, I don't really think Chicago will be another state. I don't want it to be. I just want to make a point that we don't want to forget that downstate has its own interests. So I'm not sure that gets them very far, but thoughts?
I think it's kind of a classic example of the cultural divide between urban America and rural America. And rural America, which is becoming smaller and smaller all the time, feels as though the cultural values of urban America are being kind of thrust down their throats because urban America has more votes. And whether or not that's true, I don't know. A former colleague of mine who actually grew up in New York and then was reporting in Kansas says that if you live out in the country and your nearest neighbor is a half mile away, you can pretty much do whatever you want. You can walk around out your front door toting a shotgun over your shoulder, do whatever you want, nobody's going to notice. When you live in a city with 3 million people stacked on top of each other, you need some socialism. You need government, somebody to set some rules. And he used to get so
Is that
annoyed.
social rules or socialism? Because
A little bit of
socialism is
both.
kind of a
Yeah.
touchy term these days.
He used to get so annoyed if we'd go to a fast food restaurant and stand in line, and the person in front of it gets to the counter and says, "Okay, now what do I want?" It's like, you don't do that. You know, move along. So he had much
Traffic
more of
is
an
worse
urban
in the big
attitude,
city too,
yeah.
by the way.
So there is a cultural divide. We've seen it in politics, both at the state level and at the national level, certainly. And that's just another indication of it. I got the impression that Mayor-Elect Lightfoot was kind of trying to bridge that a little bit in her speech. There are other people who aren't quite ready to build that bridge yet.
I mean, the numbers tell a different story than the political rhetoric, right? And this is John Jackson, who's a emeritus professor at Southern Illinois University, had one of their researchers at the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute said, you know, you look at the collar counties, they get about 53 cents back for every dollar they send to Springfield. Central Illinois, it's $1.87, and it's $2.81 for Southern Illinois in terms of the money. For every dollar they spend to Springfield, they are getting 280% back.
In Southern Illinois.
Right, and that is investment in places like Southern Illinois University. It's investment in prisons, which are a huge job creator downstate. And I don't know if, you know, the argument you'd make about, well, you know, the universities are benefiting a lot of Chicago and suburban kids. Are you making that same argument about the prisons, that they're benefiting people? I mean, come on.
There are a lot of jobs.
It's a lot of jobs for downstate that the government is, you know, responsible for. So I think that, you know, this is just something where, you know, it may please the voters, but it's certainly not something that actually helps unify the people of Illinois. And I can't imagine that, you know, this sort of division, I mean, it's fine if you want to make people want to make a political talking point about it, but it's not something that's, you know,
on that note, we will repair the world soon. Peter Hancock, thanks for joining us. Brian Mackey, thanks for your conversation. I'm Bernie Schoenburg. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.